The main idea's connection to the story arc, story structure. Let's talk about the main idea and story structure. The main idea and the climax of your story must be closely related. Specifically, the climax of your story should be the moment when you learn the lesson that is the main idea. But let's back up. The sequence of events in your story should show some small but specific change in you from the initial conflict to the climax. In the you that is portrayed in the exposition and in the initial conflict, there should be something that you are insensitive to that you, in the climax, learn to be more sensitive about. Or something that you're overly sensitive to, that in the climax you learn not to worry about so much. This change in you, this lesson learned, should be consistent with the lesson in the main idea. In the main idea, the lesson is stated universally, but in the story, we see how you learn the lesson in the story from your life experience. But before you get to the climax, you must figure out what is the sequence of events leading up to it from the initial conflict that will best show that particular change in you. This period of time, the period of time between the event that is your initial conflict and the event that is the climax, is the time frame of the story. This time frame should be structured to illustrate the main idea that you mean to convey, the moral of the story. So consider that the same story would be told differently depending upon what main idea it is being told to illustrate. Here's an example. Let's imagine that a student, Joe, has selected as the subject for his story speech the story of when he took his father's car without permission and got into an accident with it. Joe doesn't yet know the main idea, but he knows that it's an interesting story, so he begins listing the sequence of events in order to figure out what the most important ones are and what possible point, main idea, he could make with his story. So in his notes, he begins a very rough draft of what will ultimately become the body of his speech. So the sequence of events, as he's hashing it out, began on a mid-October morning. He got up early and asked his dad to borrow the car. And his dad always trusted him. Joe was a responsible kid and they had a good relationship, so it was kind of a formality. He expected Dad would say yes, but Dad said no. Dad said, "I know I usually say yes. I can't explain now. It has nothing to do with you. I'll explain tonight. I gotta go." And Dad leaves for work. Joe didn't know what to make of this at first, and he eventually started to get angry about it. He didn't believe that it wasn't about him, and so he decided, after his father went to work, that he would take the car and show his dad that he can be responsible using the car. Joe got about 3 blocks from the house, rolled through a stop sign, and was hit by another car. The damage was not extensive, but it was just enough in the wheel well so that the car was undrivable. It ended up being about $1,600 worth of damage. Because the car was undrivable, Joe had to walk home after the insurance information was exchanged and the tow truck came. As Joe was walking home, he walked past Tommy's house. And Tommy's house caught his eye because Tommy was kind of a bully, and Tommy's dad was also like that. In fact, everyone in the neighborhood was afraid of Tommy's dad. Tommy was too, even though Tommy wouldn't admit it. And Joe had the thought, as he noticed Tommy's house, that if Joe had feared his own dad the way Tommy feared his dad, he wouldn't be in this mess. Anyway, still hashing out the sequence of events in this first draft of what will become the body, another event that might be significant is that 10 months later, a check came in the mail from the other driver's insurance company, a check for $2,000. The letter that was attached said that the other driver was found to be 80% at fault, and the check was in excess of the $1,600 that it actually cost. Joe's dad happily kept the money, and that probably is the last significant detail of the story. But we don't yet have a main idea. We have a sequence of events, but we're not sure why we're telling it. So, as I just talked through it, let's look at the sequence of events placed on a timeline. Now that Joe has a draft of the sequence of events, he's starting to see some possible main ideas that could be illustrated by this story. 2 possible main ideas occur to him. He must now choose one and then structure the story appropriately so that it serves his chosen main idea. Here are the 2 possible main ideas he's considering. Possible main idea 1. Fear can be a good thing because it can prevent us from doing things that are foolish, embarrassing, dangerous, or just not in our best interest to do. Possible main idea number 2. When one is able to manipulate the rules of a system to his or her advantage, right and wrong inevitably become less important to that person. Here's a question for you to think about. What is the time frame if Joe uses main idea number 1? What is the time frame if he uses main idea number 2? Let's consider both. If Joe uses main idea number 1, the climax of his story must be the moment he passed Tommy's house and realized that in this particular situation it would have better served him to have feared his father. Joe would structure this version of the story as follows. The exposition would be a brief description of his relationship with his father. The initial conflict would be the moment Joe takes the car without permission. The climax would be the moment Joe walks past Tommy's house and makes a realization about fear. And the tag or coda could be a brief description of how this incident affected his relationship with his father, or how it affected his attitude about fear. So the time frame for this version of the story is a few hours. Remember that the time frame is the period of time between the initial conflict, in this case Joe taking the car without permission, and the climax, in this case Joe walking past Tommy's house. Now let's consider how the story would be structured if Joe uses main idea number 2. If Joe uses main idea number 2, the climax of his story must be the moment the $2,000 check arrived and he observes his father keep the extra money. Joe would structure this version of the story as follows. The exposition would be a brief description establishing his father as an honest, honorable, ethical person. The initial conflict would be the moment the accident occurs. The climax would be when the check in excess of the amount of their damages arrives and is kept by Joe's father. And the tag or coda could be a brief description of how this experience altered his impression of his father, or how it affected his sense of ethics. So the time frame for this version of the story is about 10 months. Remember that the time frame is the period of time between the initial conflict, in this case the moment of the accident, and the climax, in this case Joe's father keeping the extra money. To review, the period of time between the initial conflict to the climax is the time frame of your story. So it's important to have a clearly defined sequence of events and link them to your main idea. If the main idea changes, then the initial conflict and climax change. We've gone through 2 possible structures for this story to support 2 different main ideas in order to illustrate that even the same story would be told differently depending upon what main idea the story is meant to illustrate. To wrap up our example, as soon as Joe decides which main idea he's going to go with, he would do a new draft of his outline. And that is the connection between the main idea and the story arc that your speech should have.